Automation dependency. As I mentioned earlier today, the reason this segment is in this course is because as we look at this accident history, what we find is that in 68% of these accidents, automation dependency plays a significant part in leading these crews to either a critical flight attitude or the requirement to extract max performance from their planes. I'm kind of a simple guy. I'm going to suggest to you that there's basically 3 levels of automation in our planes. The lowest level of automation, you might call manual, is when you're hand flying the airplane, the throttles and the controls, and by the inputs and cues that you're getting from your instrumentation and your outside visual cues, you are determining the vertical and lateral path of this plane by flying it. The next highest level of automation would be when you have an autopilot engaged and you're using the flight guidance system in your airplane to tell that autopilot what to do with the plane's flight path for short periods of time. You know, like flight level change, vertical speed, altitude hold, heading select, that stuff. And then the highest level of automation is when we have an autopilot engaged and we're using a flight management computer to tell that autopilot what to do with the flight path of this plane for hours and hours. Low, medium, high. Now the question becomes, which is the appropriate level for the task at hand? You know, you could say all this automation was put in our 2-man airplanes to reduce the workload on the 2-man crew. That's why it's in there. And you could say that to go up a level of automation will reduce workload, and that would be true in many scenarios. You know, FMC hooked up to an autopilot's a great workload reducer for crossing the North Atlantic. You can also say, however, that going down a level in automation will reduce workload in certain scenarios. And as we study the accident history, what we find in the vast majority of the cases is this: that the crew, the 2-man crew, has lost situation awareness. Well, how'd that happen? Well, the 2-man crew became task saturated. Well, how'd they become task saturated? In the vast majority of the accidents, they became task saturated because they were trying to operate at too high a level of automation and a rapidly changing flight path requirement. Did you hear what I just said? They needed to drop down a level in order to maintain their situation awareness. They had to reduce workload. Here's an example. Suppose you're coming in on a star somewhere. Let's say in an FMC airplane to start with. We'll deal with flight guidance too in a minute. We're coming in an FMC airplane on a star someplace. And we've probably had that star arrival all loaded up in that computer for an hour or more. And everything's going just as planned, and we're in LNAV and VNAV, and everything's going just great. And we're stroking down the star, and as long as everything goes as planned, it all works perfect. But let's say as you're coming through around 20,000 feet or so, the controller calls you up and says, American Umpty-Ump, change your arrival. I want you to turn left now, head so-and-so, descend to maintain such-and-such an altitude, intercept the so-and-so radial of the such-and-such VOR for the arrival to Umpty-Ump runway. At this point, is it time to go? Or is it time to drop down a level? It's time to drop down a level, isn't it? I mean, what did he just say? He said, head so-and-so, heading select, so-and-so, descend to such-and-such an altitude, set it, flight level change. Now the plane's going where he asked us to go. And our head's up, and we know it is. And then he said, intercept so-and-so radial. Well, tune it in, identify it, present it, because you have to. That's given work. American Airlines says we must have that raw data presented to do this stuff. That's given amount of work. It must be done. Now, if you have time later to go type it all in and get it full up and you wish to and then hook up, fine. But it shouldn't be your initial move. Because what happens if you make that initial move? Well, 2 things happen. First off, the airplane's not going where you want it to go yet. Second, If one guy's typing and changing flight path, the other guy must check it, or gal. Let there be no doubt. We do not change the flight paths in these FMCs without both pilot agreeing that the new flight path is correct. The reason that is because these FMCs are not error resistant. They're not even close. By that I mean you can type into these FMCs something that is clearly wrong, and the FMC will do it. Likewise, you can type into these FMCs something that is absolutely correct, but because of a database anomaly that you have no way of knowing about, it comes up with the wrong answer. You got to check that work. It takes two people. That takes time. That task saturates the crew. Another great example, it applies to you flight guidance airplanes just as well as the FMC kind of people. And I bet every pilot in this room has seen this. I bet you have all seen this act. Watch. I'm out there doing one of my once-a-month turnarounds, you know, that I get to do. And so I'm out there doing one of those. I think it was a Vail turnaround. In fact, Doug was on my jump seat watching, and we'd gone out to Vail, and we're coming back, and we're doing one of those arrivals. You know, coming in from the northwest at Dallas. They used to call it the Boyd's arrival. Now it's called the Bowie arrival. And it's a perfect day. I mean, it's beautiful. It's clear. The only kind of day I fly on. And so we're roaring down the Bowie arrival, which I have had programmed up in my FMC since Colorado Springs, you know what I mean? And everything's going perfect. LNAV, VNAV, perfect. And I'm coming down the Bowie arrival, everything's synced up just great. I can see the airport up there, out in the distance. I got everything in sight. I'm coming through 10,000 feet. I'm all programmed up for a one-way 1-8 right arrival, aren't I? Right? And as I steam down this thing, all programmed up for a 1-8 right arrival, I come through about 10,000 and start down for 9,000. Everything's still hooked up perfect. All of a sudden, the controller says, I knew you'd seen that before. The controller says, change your runway to 13 right. Well, I'm about 26 miles out. There's the airport. I can see that piece of pavement. And as I extend that piece of pavement, I can see that line's right on my nose, i.e. I'm coming up on the final approach course. Even though I'm 25 miles out, the final approach course now is right in front of me, isn't it? And so I look out there and see that, so watch this. From the highest level, LNAV, VNAV, boom, click, 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 straight to the lowest. Remember that stuff? I got it. There's the pavement. You know, you kind of turn yourself around, you sort of line up with that pavement, you know? Remember that? There you go, all lined up with the pavement. Now listen, believe me, I am not faulting my co-pilot. I am not. We created him. Okay? My co-pilot goes, I'm flying, you know, I'm turning around here. I'm saying, hey, would you put in the ILS for 13 right? I could use the glide slope, you know, 1091, would you? You know, there's airplanes going over my head for 18 right. There's a guy right in front of me. I don't have spacing on him now. I got stuff to worry about, don't I? Heads up stuff. It's probably not a good time to be typing. You know, I mean, let me ask you this. In that scenario, you know, there's the airport, here's me, perfectly clear. What can the computer possibly bring to me that I don't already have? But you see, we have become what I call children of the magenta. You know, we think we have to have those magenta lines on the map and that magenta V-bar that's steering us toward that line, or for some reason the plane won't fly. Now I'm being facetious. You know, I know you know that. But sometimes that's probably not the right action. You know, I mean, have you flown with this guy now? And if this is you I'm talking about, do not be defensive. In the industry, we created you like this. But have you flown with this guy? You take off in your airplane, and I don't care if it's clear or weather. Let's make it a clear day. And you take off and you lift off, you gear up, you know, you go through first 7 climb, second 7 climb, you clean up, you set climb power, and everything's going pretty good. You're coming through about 600-700 feet, and my co-pilot says, hey, could I have the center autopilot in command? That's fine. I have no problem with that. Put the center autopilot on. Now that the center autopilot's engaged, though, watch his body English. Watch his body English. Oh, the autopilot's on now. Hand leaves the controls. Hands leave the throttles. Feet fall to the floor. Hands fall to the lap. He's at peace with himself. You see, the autopilot's got it now. We cannot afford it. Now, you guys and gals know I don't mean 35,000 feet. But when we're down there in the pattern, we're maneuvering, we're changing configurations, we got power settings going back and forth. The pilot flying, even though the autopilot is on, has got to remain tactilely connected to this plane and mentally flying it, doesn't he? So he will quickly recognize any deviation from acceptable performance parameters or intended flight path. I mean, look at Bucharest. As you may remember, an A310 aircraft, which is a conventionally flown aircraft and behaves much like an A300, Boeing 757 or 767, experienced an auto-throttle malfunction on departure from the Bucharest airport. Due to weather conditions at the time, there was no visible horizon. When climb power was selected, investigators believed the right throttle mechanically jammed. Since the auto-throttle system senses total thrust required for climb power, the left throttle was slowly retarded to idle. As a result, the aircraft's 18-degree nose-high attitude diminished to 0 degrees. The aircraft continued to bank further to the left. Passing through about 40 degrees as the thrust differential increased, the aircraft continued rolling until it was nearly inverted. Look at Bucharest. If the co-pilot had just had his hands on the throttles, 128 people would still be alive today. The red box on this slide is not in your operating manuals. This red box really is from Cecil to you. What we're trying to say here, and I think what Cecil's trying to say here, is that we have to go back. Back when I started 25 years ago with American Airlines, I was an engineer on the engineer seat for low 7 or 8 years, and every time I came back here to recurrent training, I sat in that engineer seat and I listened to those check airmen telling those pilots, fly the plane first, fly the plane first. And the pilots did. They flew the plane first. But then about 15 years ago, we started to become more and more automated in our cockpits, and as the level of automation increased more and more, we started talking about pushing buttons up here on an AFDS manual or typing in typewriters down here, okay, to make the airplane's flight path adjust. Because we were being told by the industry that we were to become automation managers. But the accident history of the first 6 years of the 90s clearly shows automation managers plugging themselves into the ground all over this planet. We are not automation managers. We are captains and pilots. And by our aviator skills, we are to ensure the vertical and lateral paths of these planes at all times. We will use the wonderful tools of automation that have been provided to us to help us with that task. But when the automation is not maintaining the intended flight path, we will turn it off and maintain the path by our skills.